How are you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm fine, thanks, and I hope you are too.
Good, thank you.
It's been I'd hesitate to say an exciting week, but it's certainly a very interesting week and a somewhat troubling week. To start with, the withdrawal of American troops from Syria, which has obviously led to more fighting and more problems instead of helping to, as America had been doing before, trying to relieve the current situation, and then sending more troops to Saudi Arabia, which is going to increase the power of Saudi Arabia to cause problems in the Middle East, because
Hmm.
Saudi Arabia doesn't do anything to help anybody in the Middle East. It's all um, uh, pushing things that they consider to be in their own interests. Um, and of course, always against Iran, and Iran is really the most positive country in the Middle East, and also the most powerful. So those two things on the one hand, and then the speeches of the President of the United States in the last couple of days, which we've talked before about informalization. It seems as though informalization is going to the extremes. Um, uh, that there's no longer any rules about what can be said in public to other people or about other people.
Hmm. Hmm.
The only really positive thing that I'm aware of in this past week that is worth mentioning in our weekly discussion is the fact that there seems to be some progress towards an orderly Brexit, um, which I think really is a positive move for the process of globalization, because I think that what the best way for, or what should I say, the
At least
globalization
it
will
shows
work much better.
institution. At least it shows institutions can work.
If
Yeah.
globalization will work much better with a series of orderly agreements
Hmm.
between different countries, rather than entities like the European Union becoming more and more closely interconnected, which separates them from other people.
Hmm.
So even though Brexit to begin with seems to be a negative reaction in England, if it works well, it could be, in fact, a positive reaction.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Uh,
what's
I,
this signal for the future? Um, uh, the it's generally bad for the Middle East, possibly positive for Europe, but the position of the US in international diplomacy is not improving.
I've become increasingly dismayed with the American position towards Iran,
Yeah.
um, and I've taken a couple of steps back, and I look at the Iranians. I see them as a country that um, perhaps underwent their revolution in the 70s, uh, almost due to necessity. I mean, let's face it, it was a little bit of a artificial regime that they overthrew with Savak, the secret police, and then they response for the fundamentalist Islamic fervor, and they may have gone a little bit too far in that direction. But nevertheless, as you've often noted, they're the only country in the region with a constitution. They're the only country in the region with a functioning democracy other than Israel. Um, I think that I take them at their word that to the extent that they're developing a nuclear capability, it's either for peaceful purposes or at least simply to have something in their arsenal that can counterbalance Israel, to serve as a deterrence in case the Israelis decide to actually blow them out of existence. And I just do not understand why a government that is making overtures like it's making to, say, North Korea, can't go to Saudi Arabia and say, listen, you guys stay in your place. We are the biggest exporter of oil in the world, not you. We are going to Tehran and we are going to normalize relations because that's going to be better for everybody. I don't understand why that can't happen.
Well, I mean, it's very important to recognize, and America doesn't recognize, that the revolution in Iran and the change from a monarchy to an Islamic republic was a reaction against American influence. It's really quite amazing that there's no recognition in the media or in the State Department in Washington of the fact that America was the major player in the changing the government of Iran from a democratic government to a monarchy that was not democratic to begin with. It gradually became more democratic between 1954, when the change was made, and the 1970s.
But I mean, listen, I was not one of the 53 hostages in Tehran in the embassy, but all in all, I would have to say that we got off pretty cheaply for that 25 years of raping, pillaging, and plundering their natural assets.
It was really a very civilized behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And Iran has made really quite significant contributions to global civilization. The technology of irrigation is very highly developed in Iran in ways that have been very useful outside Iran, all the way from Iran through Central Asia to northern China, as well as in other parts of the Middle East. So a lot could be done, but with a good, collaborative relationship in the modern economy between Europe, the US, and Iran in the Middle East, on the one hand, and literally nothing much can be done with Saudi Arabia, because they simply don't have any of the capabilities that Iran has.
No, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. Well, I didn't mean to dissipate your focus from talking about the other two subjects, the lack of civility in the public discourse and what might or might not be happening with Brexit. But go ahead. All right.
Well, it does seem to me that the way countries are relating to each other is changing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go back to the middle of the last century, which is the time when it generally reckons, well, Casfutas, who wrote the book on informalization, generally reckons that that's when the process became visible, obvious, and that it was actually happening. When the English stopped bothering about table manners and the way people talk to each other began to become much more flexible, informal. But it's now got to the point where you can say anything. In the 1960s, even when music was changing and what was the lyrics in the development of modern music were becoming very different from anything that was sung before. Still, the language that was used was perfectly civilized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, in public, there is no there's barely any prejudice against four-letter words.
No, barely, barely. You're exactly right. I can remember when, in the '70s, when the Watergate tapes were released, being horrified at listening to President Nixon's language. And President Nixon's language is the same language that President Trump is using from the stage at his rallies now in public.
Huh.
It's a desensitization that's occurred.
Yeah. So,
But in reality, what does that mean? I mean, we often talk about what language represents in terms of a means of communication, obviously, but does it represent more than that when it begins to become this informalized?
well, I think part of the problem is that people don't learn Latin anymore,
Yeah.
and so there's no longer any what's the best way to talk about this? Any basis to the way you express yourself in English, and that means that the what is said is much less exact.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
much less meaningful. It's when spoken language overrides the history of the usage of written language, then emotion replaces the exactness of expression. And this is something that can be very, what should I say, not so much dangerous, but it makes
Very
things much
inflammatory.
less predictable, because
Yes.
it's much more difficult to know how people are going to react to what is said.
Mm-hmm.
And the significant periods of human history have been periods when what was spoken was a usage of what had been written.
That's a very good point. That's
Funny. One of the well, of course, the Latin, the period when Latin was the most important written language was a very important stage of this. But another very important stage, which is generally unknown in the Western world, is the period from the 9th century to the 19th century, when Persian was the only language that was written in the whole of the eastern half of the Islamic world, from what is now eastern Iraq all the way through to northern China.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, it was the language of administration in China for a century. It seems as though, and of course this may be to some extent caused by the development of social media, and I'm afraid I can't quote any statistics about what proportion of the global population communicates with each other on Facebook and Twitter. But obviously, I mean, the President of the United States communicates mainly on Twitter.
Right. No, I think you're exactly right in that the spoken language, as compared to the written language, has much more inflammatory potential because you're unsure as to what the reaction is going to be, and you're less precise by necessity when you're articulating it. The other thing that you mentioned in the past in these discussions is that how should I phrase this? The position class-wise of the speaker is oftentimes murkier now because of the use of the language by that speaker. All right, you have a president of the United States who is speaking as if he's the master of ceremonies at a wrestling match, and it's not, in my opinion, and I think probably in the opinion of the people who are listening to him, it's not really the kind of language that we think he should be using. And the people who are reacting the way they're reacting in his physical presence are much more reacting out of delighted shock to be sitting here saying, I was there the night the president said blank, blank, blank. And it's not that there's anything inherently wrong with breaking down any sort of class distinctions, but I just get uncomfortable with it.
Well, it's a deviant use of language.
Mm-hmm.
It means that language is functioning in a different way because it's not functioning according to the rules. Up until very recently, certainly the middle of the 19th century, and to some extent much more recently than that, people, not everybody was literate, and being literate was a mark of social class,
Mm-hmm.
where you stood in society. And if you were literate, you were closer to the way things were managed, because starting 4,000 years ago, administration had been done in writing, and the people who were literate therefore were close to political power,
Right.
and they were administrators, and so they were a social class.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, for that reason, literacy and the written language was extremely important to them. Then, because of the Industrial Revolution, we wanted everybody to be literate, so it was easier to manage people in factories, and that has meant that people who don't have the same sense of class have a bigger influence on the way the written language is used, or the relationship between written and spoken language.
Well, that's certainly what's happening now. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, the point actually that we're making in all of this that we've been talking about today is that in the age of globalization, as it's continuing to develop now, the way interaction and communication work is becoming very different from what it has been in the past. And our understanding of this began with the book on informalization a decade or so ago, but it's becoming much more serious now, even than the way the author of that book explained to us.
Well, on that note, I'm sitting in a room with a couple of thousand books, so maybe after we finish, I'll pull one down. So, all right, Professor Spooner, thank you very much. We'll look forward to talking again next week.
See you next week.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. Spooner, how are you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm fine, thanks, and I hope you are too.
Thank you.
This morning, I think you know that some time ago now, in an introductory essay to a volume on globalization, I wrote that globalization was on the cards from the start,
Yes.
because I thought that the fact that population growth had led us to spread throughout the world, and we had language, meant that sooner or later we were all going to be in contact with each other. But what's always puzzled me is why, in fact, do people always collect together in the largest possible numbers? And that's happened throughout human history. And until about 10,000 years ago, the numbers were always very small because of the availability of food, and we were not yet producing our own food.
Mm-hmm.
But since food has not become a problem, we keep collecting together in larger and larger numbers, and now we're going to become a totally urbanized world in what remains of this century, as far as I can see. Anyway, somebody I met in an elevator a few years ago and got talking to about the axial age and big history, and then we became quite close friends and have been talking to each other ever since. Had an interesting new idea this week, which he told me about, which I think helps us to understand a lot of things. And that is that when we left our primate cousins up in the trees in South Central Africa and came down onto the plains and wandered out away from the trees on the plains, we were vulnerable to predators. Yes. In a way that we had never been before. And it was then that we started collecting together in larger and larger numbers in order for security. And that tendency seems to have been part of our evolution, because after all, we had not evolved entirely into the creatures we became in the following millennia. That was hundreds of thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. And so I think that explains it. However, the problem, of course, that we have now is that we have to organize ourselves, and it's our organization of ourselves which is leading to all the problems. So this evolutionary proclivity that appears to have been launched a few 100,000 years ago is still driving us to collect together in larger and larger numbers. And now there are really no restrictions on that process. Mm-hmm. But because as the numbers get larger, the organizational problems get bigger. All the problems we're having in globalization have to do with different forms of organization. And of course, when the literacy helped us to develop much larger forms of political organization and economic organization, for that matter. And then the age of empires started with literate administrations some 4,000 years ago, and lasted really until the middle of the last century, when we finally got rid of the European empires. But the empires really did bring things closer together. Mm-hmm. But the problem with the empires was that they divided the world up into administrative districts, and when they disintegrated and ceased to be empires in the middle of the last century, or in the first since 1900. Their administrative districts became what we have come to call nation states, because of the problems of the relation of the interrelation of spiritual and political authority, mm-hmm. which we've solved in some ways for some periods, as with the Pope and the archbishops and so on in the Catholic Church, but not on a permanent basis, as we can see with the Reformation 500 years ago. Anyway, so now we have this problem of conflict between, since the end of the Age of Empires, we've had a sort of fake empire run by America as the world hegemon, and that has added to the problems of the formation of nation states, because the whole point of the formation of nation states was that each state would be independent in terms of religion as well as political organization, and and no state would have the right to tell neighboring states what the correct interpretation of the Bible was. Mm-hmm. But the problem with American hegemony has been that not only has it been influencing the development of nation states since the end of the empires, but it's also been exerting cultural influence in other ways. And so now we have this terrible problem between well, with Iran, for example, in the Middle East. And last Friday, when we were unable to meet, I spent the day in Washington at a board meeting of an organization that is a consortium of American universities, and I was representing the University of Pennsylvania, working out how to solve some of the current problems of the American Institute of Iranian Studies, which is an organization that began in the late 60s that I've been involved in ever since. And of course, since the Iranian Revolution has not been able to function in the way that it was functioning before. And this has meant that whereas we had a way of training Iranists, people specializing in Iranian studies, which is quite a well-developed historical field of academic study. But since then, since the late 70s, we've not been able to train anybody in this field. And now all the people who were trained in that field and were heading programs in half a dozen universities in America, apart from other universities in Europe,
they're all retiring.
Are retiring, and there's nobody to replace them. So this means that whereas up until 50 years ago, we knew a lot about the world, that is in universities, although people in the State Department tended not to know very much about the rest of the world. Now, in the age of globalization, because of what we've been doing in other ways, we're not training scholars and scientists with experience in the world as a whole.
Right. Let me jump in a little bit. You've thrown a lot at me from that one elevator ride, and thankfully you indicated that you had developed a close friendship with this person, and it was not all in one elevator ride. I fully understand the fact that Neanderthals who descended from the trees and were able to make it out to the plains, especially those who could hold their young under one arm to get out to the watering hole, and thus were forced to stand up straighter because they were carrying their young, and then do that and get back into the safety of the woods, and then come back the next day with another mother with another young child, and then groups of them eventually, in order to just protect themselves in the event of predators, so more would be able to return to the safety of the trees. And going on to where we are today, I mean, this is a blink of an eye in history, right? This is what, 30 or 40 or 50,000 years or so. So where this is going to go, I think where that group of Neanderthal mothers with their babies at a watering hole out in the middle of a plain in South Central Africa, 5 or 6 of them, 50,000 years ago, to where we are now with 22 million people living in Mexico City, or 1.5 billion people connected on Facebook, to have happened in 50,000 years is pretty remarkable. And then I superimposed that fact on the President of the United States making the speech on Wednesday in front of the United Nations, in which he said globalization is dead. It's no longer operable. It's been replaced by national patriotism. And I just don't get it. I don't understand it. Is it a complete, I mean, the speech had to have been written. It clearly was not written by the president. The way he delivered it was clear. He had not read it before. It's official policy of the United States government. I mean, how is it that people are not understanding what's happening, where even the most ill-informed president of this country can stand there and make that kind of remark? I don't understand where the disconnect is. What do you think?
There's so much competition between political units of different sizes. So the large ones compete with each other globally, and now there's competition, obviously, between or developing competition between America, Europe, European Union, and China and India, actually, and locally, but among smaller units. So between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which their relationship's been in the news this past week because they can't agree on their border, which again was drawn by the British in 1893. And Africa is just a patchwork of these problems. So I'm afraid, in my mind, of course, I have to be careful what I say so that I don't appear to be chauvinist, but I think that America is causing more problems like this than any of the other large countries at the moment, although that may change as the others gradually become more powerful. Because, to a large extent, the reason is that the people in charge of policy in this country are not academically trained to understand what's going on in other parts of the world. And 50 years ago, I don't think people in America were that well trained either, partly because they are, whereas in Europe, every country is very close to every other country, and then many of them had empires which took them to all over the world. America didn't have an empire, at least not in that sense, and had two large ponds, one on either side, which separated it from what was going on in other parts of the world. And now we're told that only 30% of Americans, even now in the 21st century, have passports.
Right. So
it's really is an anomaly that the economically most powerful country in the world is the center of the least knowledge about what's going on in the rest of the world.
So in a funny way, when we several years ago would talk about nations or states, we would talk about states that were actively trying to thwart the forces of globalization. All right, and we would talk about countries such as North Korea. We would talk a little bit about Iran, I think, even. Where we are now, after several years of discussion, the United States has now entered that category.
Yeah.
Isn't that something?
Well, you know, I mean, it's such a paradox, really, that the Middle East is most of the boundaries in the Middle East were drawn by Europeans and then reinforced by Americans. And American policy since the middle of the last century has been not to export democracy, but to reinforce political stability as Americans understood it, which was not democracy, because democracy was unpredictable, partly because it wanted to nationalize local oil companies, which were American owned.
Right.
And Britain had something to do with this as well. I'm not
Anglo-American oil.
Yeah.
Well, very interesting. So what do you think when you get back to your view of the progressive nature of globalization, going back to that blink of an eye to our cousins or descendants or ancestors, I should say, coming out of the trees into the plains? Where are we going here?
Well, I think that I mean what that explains is why coming together has been a more important part of the historical process than conflict. And now there's probably more conflict now than there has been, or more serious conflict now than there has been in the past. because of these problems of organization.
Hmm.
But I think it's going to change again as the differences in economic and political power between America, the European Union, and the other large political units, especially China and India, they become more closely related to each other and have to reach some sort of agreement, because at the moment there's no effort at all to reach agreement on a global level. The United Nations was, in a way, developed with that purpose, but has been not been successful.
Well, I think we should probably leave it at there, Professor Spooner. Very interesting. I'm going to keep that in mind as I try to interpret the events of this week and the week coming up. So, all
We'll
right.
watch what happens.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.